So hi everyone, I'm Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to share with you some free tips about transitioning from quarantine. And I know some of us, have already fully transitioned, and that's great. Some of us may be in a little bit of an in-between space. And the first thing I wanted to do is actually to normalize the idea that stepping out of quarantine may not 100% feel like a picnic. And that can almost need to actually be understood, because otherwise we have all this pressure on ourselves to be feeling and acting like, oh, I'm so glad quarantine is over, as if it's nothing but just pure positives. Whereas the truth is that it is actually, while it's good and, has its positives, it's also a big change for us in terms of our routine. It can stir up a lot of uncertainty, and there can be some stress associated with it. So the first thing to do is actually just to give yourself permission to have the whole story be there for you. And the whole story may be that maybe there were parts of staying at home, that were kind of nice, or, maybe figuring out exactly how things are going to look post-quarantine does have a little bit of burden associated with it. And so the first thing that we want to do is just make room for that and recognize that it's okay to acknowledge it. The nice thing, of course, about acknowledging these things as well is that then we can start to practice really good self-care around the factors that we are actually, feeling a little bit stressed by. So you might be wondering why I have here a picture of a woman on a couch wearing a cast with a big smile on her face with crutches. The reason is because I want to talk about secondary gains for a moment. Secondary gains is a psychology term that refers to the benefits that we get from challenging situations. The classic example in psychology textbooks is usually a child that breaks their leg, and then they just get so into all the special attention and not having to go to school and all this other stuff that when it's time to take off their cast, they actually insist, that their leg is still broken. And the child oftentimes even actually really believes it. And the way that we actually get around secondary gains and make sure that we don't have secondary gains actually stop us from really putting our whole heart into moving forward when it's time to move forward from quarantine is to stop and actually notice what the secondary gains are for us. And then we can really think about ways that we can retain some of those secondary gains even after quarantine is over. So we can really have the best of all worlds. Each person is different, but some of the benefits that people in my office have been talking about would be things like having more time at home, obviously, maybe more closeness with family, certainly less commute time, perhaps spending less money on things like shopping, and also having to spend less energy on making sure we, look exactly perfect before we get into the office and things like that. It's just important to be in touch with what your secondary gains are, because if we're not conscious of those things and really thinking about how we can keep those benefits even after quarantine, then sometimes, we can end up like that little child that, doesn't feel ready to go back to school because they're actually so attached to some of the benefits of their, broken leg. It's also important to understand that many of us might have even tuned out some of the negatives and actually deliberately really focused on the positives of those secondary gains that we were just talking about. We might have done that as a healthy coping strategy during quarantine, because when we had no choice but to just be in quarantine, the most productive thing to do might have been to actually just focus on the positives about it. And so now we might be in a little bit of a cognitive habit of just constantly only thinking about the positives without really thinking so much about the negatives. So it's actually what was once maybe a very healthy strategy of just only thinking about those secondary gains. Now that we're starting to think about transitioning from quarantine, we want to transition our thinking style a little bit as well and start thinking about how we can keep those secondary gains even after quarantine. So, for example, clients have been talking about learning to have family dinners at least twice a week, or learning how to say no to extraneous activities like that they just used to find themselves running around town all the time, and they don't want to get back into that space. So they just want to learn how to be a little bit more discriminating about which events they'll say yes to, for example, or even just thinking about budgeting and monitoring spending so that the pre-COVID time doesn't start to look exactly like the post-COVID time in a good way. So another thing that we can think about is what I call our key takeaways. Again, so what are those positive things that you got from quarantine, and how can you take them with you? So I would encourage you to think about, again, just actually really listing those things out for yourself. Again, whether it be more time with your family, or finally having your shopping budget under control, or even just the idea of having a little bit more downtime in your calendar. But if you go ahead and you list out what are the things that you definitely want to continue even after quarantine, that should actually make the process of saying goodbye to quarantine easier, because you're not going to also be saying goodbye to the secondary gains. Another thing about quarantine that might help us to have a smoother transition is to think a little bit about the process of closure. And ironically, to think about closure, we sometimes actually have to go back to the beginning. And for many of us, when quarantine started in March, there was a lot of fear. I mean, there were, death projections in the millions. There were shortages of, hand sanitizer and other things at grocery stores that, people need. And that provoked a lot of fear and anxiety for people, understandably, as they just kind of shut themselves into their home. And so now that we're starting to open the door again, literally and figuratively, we might need to actually go back and process some of those old feelings from March. Because the good news is that we're now in a very different situation than we were in March. We have a lot more knowledge and information about the way the virus works. We have ventilators, and all of our hospitals are really much more prepared now, so that's great. But there's a part of us that still might need to come to terms with some of the initial feelings that we felt when this whole process began. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that you can achieve, that closure. You might be saying, well, Chloe, closure sounds nice, but really, how do I get it? And there's two ways I'm going to share with you. So one way would just be to actually write what I call your quarantine story. And it could just even be as simple as one page, but noting down, thinking back to March, where were you when you first learned about this coronavirus and about quarantine? And what was it like for you when you were told that you couldn't go back into the office? And what were some of the feelings that you felt, and what were some of the shortages that you encountered as you were, maybe trying to get things that you needed? And going through some of those memories and some of those feelings, and then also including in your story a little bit about some of the secondary gains that you started to discover. And then if you wanted to, you could even also include in your story that part of your quarantine closure experience was actually to watch this webinar, this live stream, and to say, and then I learned about the idea of actually writing a story about my experience as I'm preparing to, move forward. And so that's what I'm doing now. And, these are my reflections on my quarantine experience, as I'm moving forward. And it might sound silly, but there's actually something what we call in psychology, which is called narrative building. And as people are able to build their personal narrative, they do feel more in control, they feel less stress, and they feel more strategic. And so just taking a moment to even write like a one-page summary of your quarantine experience, including the part of moving towards closure, could help you to feel a little bit more resolved about the issue. One other technique that might help you to have closure is to do a little bit of a guided imagery exercise. And so what you would do there, if you've ever done any kind of guided imagery before, that's great. If not, this is a fine time to try. It's pretty simple. If you've ever, even really had a daydream before, then you've had some experience with guided imagery. And so what you would do is you would just imagine yourself, say 1 year into the future in June of 2021, and you imagine yourself talking with a friend, clinking glasses maybe as you cheers or have a dinner or lunch together, and, picture yourselves both talking and laughing and reflecting back on this, spring, summer of 2020 when quarantine was a thing, and, just remembering together what it was like. And what that activity can do is it can help to kind of nudge your mind a little bit into a different place of perspective about quarantine. I kind of compare it, for example, when I have a client who's going through a really bad breakup and they feel like they're never gonna, live again or love again. I'll sometimes ask them to think about a previous breakup with a different person that maybe they felt the same way about, and then reflecting back on that experience and realizing that in fact now they feel quite over that person from the past. And so then I'll ask them to imagine themselves in the future feeling the same way about the current breakup. So that's one way that you can actually use a little bit of guided imagery to nudge yourself forward and to remind your mind that you do have the ability to move forward and have a little bit more perspective. Now, another thing that is obviously going to be coming up for many of us, is the topic of uncertainty. We can say, okay, well, closure is fine, but what comes next after that? And I'm going to be going into that now, but I'll just share with you that the bottom line is that certainly we always want to focus on what we can control rather than the things that we cannot control. And you may have heard that before, but we're going to be going a little bit deeper into what are some of the things that you can control and how can you keep your focus on those things. And also we want to increase our self-care. And we also want to remember that this is actually an opportunity for growth, to increase our ability to rely on ourselves during challenging times. When this is all over one day, we're going to be able to say, wow, I lived through quarantine, and during difficult times, sometimes relationships tend to either get a lot better or they really go sideways. And that's true of your relationship with yourself as well. So this is definitely a time when we want to increase our self-care. Now, again, about uncertainty, I work with high-functioning people, which I'm guessing probably most people watching this live stream are, would be considered high-functioning people, and high-functioning people sometimes struggle with uncertainty because they're afraid that it means that they haven't really done their due diligence, or, that maybe they're missing something, and so they can get a little bit critical or antsy when there's uncertainty. And sometimes that's actually a good thing. That stimulates them to go seek information and get clarity. That's a healthy strategy if clarity is actually available, but it's really not the best strategy if clarity is not available. And of course, clarity is really not available on exactly what, the reopening and everything is going to look like. So what I would encourage you to do is to recognize that, nobody knows what's going to happen next. You're definitely not alone in that. And so you might also want to recognize that, in fact, awareness of uncertainty, the ability to articulate and name it, that's actually a gift. That's a sign of maturity. People who are unable or unwilling to tolerate or acknowledge uncertainty are vulnerable to creating narratives as if uncertainty exists when it actually doesn't. Or they might start to micromanage or try to control things that actually cannot be controlled, just as a way to take out their anxiety over having to deal with uncertainty in some other area of life. So we also want to maybe welcome uncertainty as a sign that we're learning some new skills here, that, some new things are happening. We're all in this together. And again, the idea that you notice the uncertainty is actually a positive thing. So now that we've said to ourselves, okay, we're going to definitely acknowledge the fact that it's here. We're going to accept it and maybe even learn to embrace it and grow from it. Here are some tips about that. We want to think about the things that we can control. One of those things is going to be, for example, exposure